The woman they thought was just a maid ended up stripping an entire billionaire family of their inheritance in mere minutes. She walked into the grand hall where chandeliers hung like artificial tears frozen mid-fall. Her faded gray dress, worn-out flats, and cloth bag made her look out of place. Who is she? The maid? God, I hope she's not some old mistress hoping for a payout. The whispers swept through the room like a cold draft. But she didn't stop, because she wasn't here to beg or to be acknowledged. She was here because she had stayed up countless nights by Mr. Davenport's hospital bed. She was here to see who would stand and who would fall when the truth came out. No one expected that inside her weathered cloth bag was the original marriage certificate, and in just a few minutes the name Clara Holden Davenport would be called as the sole heir to the billion-dollar empire built by her husband. Richard Davenport, once hailed as the uncrowned king of Manhattan real estate, had mysteriously vanished for 15 days. The police hadn't reached any conclusions, but his family? They weren't about to wait any longer. While the newspapers still plastered his face across front pages with headlines like "The Last Hope," behind the moss-covered iron gates of the Davenport estate, a funeral was already in motion. Quiet, swift, calculated. The ceremony was held in the family's stately hall. At its center, a sealed casket, not with a body, but with Richard's favorite suit, folded with surgical precision. A symbolic goodbye. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew they hadn't come to mourn. They had come to divide. Nieces, nephews, siblings, advisors, longtime investors, everyone dressed to impress. Their silk handkerchiefs caught just enough tears. Their condolences rolled off their tongues like rehearsed lines. Richard's death wasn't a tragedy. It was convenient. And his fortune? A reward they each believed they deserved. But this funeral, which they assumed was the epilogue of a great life, was actually just the prologue to a truth none of them were prepared to face. The heavy double doors on the left creaked open, quietly enough that no one really noticed. There were no clicking heels, no fur coats or luxury handbags. Just a small figure slipping in like a cold draft through the cracks of a room sealed tight with power and pride. Clara Holden, 58, her silver-streaked hair tied in a neat bun, wore a faded gray coat over a plain cotton dress. Her worn-out flats brushed against the marble floor, and slung over her shoulder was an old cloth bag, its seams etched with the dust of time. She didn't glance around, didn't need anyone to look at her. She had come only to say goodbye to the man who once called her family. And yet her silence was the very thing that made her stand out in a sea of hushed voices, sidelong glances, and eyes sharper than knives. She had barely taken 3 steps when the whispers began to ripple through the lavish hall like a venomous breeze. Who invited her? A sharp female voice cut in from the right, just loud enough for Clara to hear and just quiet enough for others to feel emboldened. Probably the old housekeeper. Came to try her luck? Preston Davenport, Richard's nephew, muttered with a smirk, adjusting his gaudy gold tie. Clara paused, not out of offense. She'd heard it all before. Instead, she quietly chose a spot near the large window overlooking the garden. The same garden where, every April, she used to plant lavender pots because Richard once said the scent helped him sleep. No one greeted her. No one offered a seat. Only glances and curled lips. "She looks like she walked straight out of a church charity line," whispered Marissa, the youngest daughter of Richard's sister, nudging her friend beside her. "What's she even doing here? This is supposed to be a family service." "Maybe she mistook it for a soup kitchen," someone chuckled, their laugh bubbling up between sips of champagne and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Clara didn't turn around. She stood still. Her eyes clouded with sorrow, but her spine remained straight. One hand gently touched the strap of her bag, not from fear, but as if to remind herself, stay calm. This was his home, his last chosen place. A young waiter passed by, glanced at Clara with a flicker of hesitation, then quickly looked away, wary of drawing attention from the room's more appropriate guests. Across the hall, Eleanor, the eldest sister-in-law, stood near the ebony fireplace, slowly twisting the diamond ring on her finger. "If Richard were alive to see this," she sighed. "I doubt he'd let the help wander through his funeral like she belongs here." Clara heard every word, but she didn't let them touch her heart, because deep down she knew the only place she ever truly belonged in this room now rested quietly in that casket. Or at least that's what everyone believed. Clara Holden's quiet arrival might have passed like a breeze if she hadn't remained standing there. It was her stillness, her unsettling calm in a room full of people who demanded deference, that began to irritate them more than any outburst ever could. In their world, silence was weakness, and weakness was something to crush. Marissa was the first to approach. Her crimson dress swept elegantly across the marble floor, each step seeming to stamp disdain into the ground beneath her. She stopped less than a meter from Clara, tilting her head, eyes scanning her from head to toe like she was a stain ruining an otherwise perfect scene. "Excuse me, Mrs. Holden, was it?" Marissa's voice was sharp and syrupy, like a knife wrapped in velvet. "I think there's been a little misunderstanding. Today's ceremony is for family, not for former staff?" She smiled coldly. "Were you planning to dust the fireplace or something?" A ripple of laughter followed, an ugly little chorus that had been waiting for its cue. Clara didn't turn, didn't speak. "Silence? So she admits it," Preston declared, raising his wine glass so the oversized diamond on his ring caught the light. "She's here, hoping Richard left her a little tip in the will." A middle-aged woman with expertly curled hair chimed in, her posh voice feigning concern while laced with judgment. "I heard Richard was rather generous to long-time help." She emphasized the word help with almost theatrical weight. "Perhaps Mrs. Clara is just here to collect a belated thank you." Then a child, Marissa's daughter, no more than 10, tugged at her mother's dress and asked, "Mommy, who's that lady? Why is she dressed like the old woman who sells newspapers?" The group burst into laughter, as if the child had just delivered the joke of the evening. Still, Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes remained on the large window, where April sunlight filtered through soft clouds and touched the rows of lavender beginning to bloom. It wasn't that she didn't see or didn't hear. She was simply choosing not to lower herself to the same ground. But her silence, rather than disarming them, only enraged them more. In their eyes, for someone to be humiliated and yet remain standing tall was an insult, as if their scorn wasn't enough to bend her, and that was unacceptable. Could someone please escort her out? An older man, a longtime business associate of Richard's, finally said, "We're about to read the will, and her presence is unsightly." "Yes, indeed," Clara heard Eleanor say, the silver-haired sister-in-law. "It's quite improper to have an outsider in the middle of a memorial. Richard would never have allowed it." Clara turned for the first time. She didn't look at anyone in particular, just a glance, calm and deep, like a lake undisturbed by wind. Not defiance, but memory. Her hand still rested gently on the strap of her bag, and her back stood even straighter. No one knew that inside that worn cloth. Bag wasn't just a handkerchief and a little notebook. It held the truth, and a will. Clara's silence, calm, unwavering, and as grounded as the old lavender roots in the back garden, should have made them pause. But to people who were used to living above others, that silence became a target. And when they couldn't tear her down with words, they moved to their second weapon, public humiliation. Clara remained in her corner of the room, near the tall window where morning light spilled across the marble floor like silver water. But behind her, soft snickers had begun, short, stifled, but brimming with cruel delight. Trevor Lang, Richard's nephew, once cut from a family project for falsifying documents, crept toward Clara, a napkin and black fountain pen in hand. He didn't need to be subtle. Everyone was watching, and more importantly, no one objected. With quick strokes, he scrawled a single word on the napkin, "Beggar," then casually stuck it to the frayed strap of Clara's cloth bag like labeling a charity item. Clara had no idea. She was still gazing into the garden where the old oak tree Richard had planted with her on his 60th birthday stood tall, a memory only she now carried. But the younger crowd in the room had no use for memories. Evans, Richard's youngest grandniece and a minor internet celebrity for mocking luxury life fails, had already pulled out her phone. Her eyes sparkled as if she were about to record her next viral post. "Start live streaming, Elise," she murmured to her best friend and PR sidekick. "She's perfect. We'll call it Uninvited Guest at the Millionaire Funeral. Oh, and let's use hashtag shower from maid to made up." Elise giggled and held up her phone. The camera rolled, capturing Clara standing still, solemn, with a note of shame unknowingly stuck to her back, surrounded by glittering gowns and tailored suits like she had wandered into the wrong dimension. Within minutes, the clip spread to thousands of viewers. The comments poured in, venom-laced. "She looks like she escaped from the kitchen staff? Did someone invite her? Or is she at the wrong funeral? Is this a charity drive? Perfect meme material?" Clara didn't know her image was being mocked on half the phones in the room, but she felt a shift, an unease in the air. The eyes on her no longer held just contempt. Now they gleamed with satisfaction. Marissa leaned toward Preston and whispered, "I can't believe she's still standing there, like she actually belongs here." Preston shrugged, eyes locked on his screen. "Just wait for the lawyer. Once the will's read, everyone will see where she really stands. Not even a footnote." Across the room, Eleanor stood with her arms crossed, lips pursed like she'd caught a foul smell. "If Richard were still in his right mind," she muttered, "he'd never let someone like her through the front door." And still, Clara didn't turn, but this time her gaze drifted away from the window. It dropped to her sleeve. And lingered. A strange texture brushed against her arm, paper, foreign, out of place. She raised her hand and peeled it off. One glance was enough. No need to read aloud, no need to ask questions. She knew. She folded the napkin and tucked it into her coat pocket like someone storing evidence. Not to retaliate, not yet, but to remember, to record every face, every smirk, every cruel laugh. Because very soon they would all need her to remember exactly how they behaved. The antique clock above the fireplace struck 10. Its chime echoed through the grand hall like a knife slicing through the shrill dissonance of laughter, cutting the room into silence. The mahogany doors on the west side opened softly, and in walked Arthur Grayson, Richard Davenport's private attorney for the past 25 years. No one could mistake him. Silver hair neatly combed, a classic ash-gray suit tailored to perfection, silver-rimmed glasses catching the crystal lights above, and an old leather briefcase that looked as seasoned as the years he'd spent navigating disputes in elite boardrooms. His leather shoes clicked steadily on the marble floor, each step deliberate, pulling the room into a hush so complete it rang in the ears. Every eye turned to him, but no one spoke, because everyone knew what he was about to read couldn't be undone. Grayson stopped at the long table draped in black velvet, set down his briefcase, and calmly unlocked it. No theatrics, no preamble, just a man who had come carrying the truth. From across the room, Clara Holden watched him. Her eyes were calm, though perhaps a shade deeper than usual. It wasn't fear. It was knowing. Knowing that the thinnest thread now stood between pretense and revelation. But before Grayson could utter a word, the first voice came not from him, but from someone else, an old acquaintance. Gerald Hayes, Richard's longtime business partner now retired, stood from his chair. His voice was deep, sharp with conviction. "Before you read that," he said, pointing directly at Clara, "let me be clear. That woman does not belong here." His finger was rigid, his gaze dark. "Richard was my friend. I knew him. and he would never allow someone like her to interfere in family matters. A few people nodded, almost instinctively. Preston smirked, stroking his chin as if someone had finally dared to say out loud what they'd all been thinking. "I agree," Preston said, stepping forward with a proud voice. "I don't know who she is, but it's obvious she's here to exploit the situation. Some former maid slipping into a funeral and just standing there like she has any right." "Probably hoping for some grief gratuity," Marissa added, eyes glued to her phone screen. Grayson looked up. His voice remained steady, dispassionate, as if he were reading a legal bulletin. "If the room is done commenting, I would like to proceed with my duties." "Hold on," Evans interjected, her face glowing from her phone's screen light. "I think before you say anything, you should verify if she's even on the guest list." Grayson closed his briefcase with a soft snap, withdrawing a dark brown envelope sealed in red wax. "Miss Evans, the guest list is written into this will, and I am authorized to read it, with or without the approval of anyone in this room." Silence returned, but this time it wasn't reverence. It was dread. A few glances flickered toward Clara, some sharp, others suddenly unsure. Still, the loudest voices remained those wrapped in inherited power. "You're being manipulated, Arthur," Gerald persisted. "If Richard really included her, then he must not have been in his right mind. She's an uneducated, nameless woman with no social value." Clara didn't flinch, didn't argue, but her eyes, this time, had changed, no longer soft. They gleamed like steel against stone, unshaken, honest. Grayson held her gaze for a moment, then gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement shared only between those who knew the truth deeper than any paper could hold. Then he began to read. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Thomas Davenport, signed and witnessed legally on the 12th day of August, 2022. The estate includes full equity in Davenport Holdings, all private and commercial real estate located in New York, Boston, Aspen, and all domestic and international banking assets." Each line fell like a ticking bomb. The air was thick, compressed, waiting to explode. Grayson paused just long enough. His eyes swept across faces no longer serene, but taut with restrained panic. "And the sole inheritor of this estate is the one person he trusted, someone who stood by him without ever chasing status or gain. That person is his lawful wife, Clara Holden Davenport." The first thing to shatter wasn't a wine glass, it was the pride of an entire room. For a moment, the grand hall fell into a silence so absolute, it felt like time had forgotten to move. It was as if no one, none of them draped in black designer suits, weighed down by jewelry and cloaked in grief, thinly veiling their greed, had truly heard what Grayson just said. Clara Holden Davenport, sole heir, the entire estate, undivided, unconditional. Then, like a storm held back too long, the outrage erupted. "This is impossible," Preston shouted, his champagne glass trembling in his hand, the liquid sloshing dangerously at the rim. "This is some sick joke. A setup? Richard would never—" "Richard didn't have a wife?" Marissa shrieked, her voice slicing through the air. "He never said a word about marriage. Someone forged those documents, clearly." Clara stood still, hands gently clasped at her waist, her expression calm. No gloating, no pride. Just a quiet, almost sorrowful gaze, like she had just confirmed something she had long hoped wasn't true. The ripple of denial spread like wildfire. Gerald slammed his hand on the table, his eyes red, not from grief. "Mr. Grayson, you need to verify the legality of that will. A woman with no name, no title, suddenly appearing and inheriting $1 billion empire?" "This is a scam!" Evans snapped, still clutching her phone, clearly streaming the room's fury. "I don't know who she is, but she's definitely not part of this family." Grayson didn't blink. He slid another folder across the velvet-covered table, his voice as sharp and steady as a blade gliding over stone. "The documents include a marriage certificate signed at Boston City Hall, July 17th, 2016, with 2 verified witnesses and an official seal. Additionally, there is an audio recording of Mr. Davenport's final statement, recorded 3 weeks before his disappearance, all verified by legal counsel. A collective shiver ran down the necks adorned with pearls and diamonds. Evans froze mid-breath, eyes wide. Preston took a step back, his lips parted, struggling for words that wouldn't come. No way. Marissa stumbled toward the wall, gripping the carved edge of a mahogany chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. No one knew. No one ever saw them together. This is magic. A lie. It's real. Clara's voice came, soft but unmistakably firm. The room held its breath. It was the first time she had spoken. I didn't come here to justify myself. I don't owe explanations to those who never once believed I deserved a name. But Richard knew who I was, and he left his truth. In ink. Her eyes scanned the room, not with bitterness, not with vengeance, just a quiet certainty that made every smirk die in silence. Grayson picked up again, gently holding up a copy of the photo attached to the documents. Richard in a simple suit, Clara in a plain white dress, the 2 of them beaming beneath the lavender tree's bloom. Love, he said slowly, doesn't always ask to be announced. Sometimes it just lives long enough that nothing can hide it. No one spoke. The insults had faded, replaced by something else entirely. Fear. Not fear of Clara, but of what her presence represented. That everything they thought untouchable, board seats, bloodlines, power, legacy, could disappear with a single, inconvenient truth. The grand hall froze in place. No heavy breaths, no glasses trembling, only the soft whistling of wind slipping through the window frames, brushing against velvet curtains that shifted just enough to feel like a signal. Something had shattered. Every gaze now locked on the quiet woman who had stood silently through the entire ceremony. Clara Holden, still in that same old cardigan, still in those worn-down flats, still with the faded cloth bag slung over her shoulder. No crown, no glow of status, and yet now in their eyes she was someone entirely different. She stepped forward, not hurried, not hesitant, as if each step had been decided long ago, not to claim victory, but because she had already endured every condescending glance they could ever throw her way. Her shoes tapped softly against the marble floor. A small sound, but in the breathless stillness of the room, it echoed like a declaration. Grayson stepped aside, offering the space without introduction, without instruction, just a nod shared between him and her, like a promise long kept between 2 people who had always known the truth. Clara stopped near the table where the open will still rested. She didn't look at those who had mocked her. She looked forward and spoke. My name is Clara Holden. And yes, I am the lawful wife of Richard Davenport. A faint scoff escaped from a corner, muffled as someone tried to swallow it. I don't blame you for not knowing, she continued, her voice low but steady. Richard and I chose a quiet life. We didn't attend galas, we weren't in magazines, and we didn't need to parade through someone's party to feel loved. A tremor passed through faces that had once laughed. For the first time, Clara was no longer the one out of place. They were. I cooked for him, cared for him through illness, sat beside him night after night, long after the boardroom lights had gone dark. I didn't come here for money, not to make a claim, but simply to state what is true, that I was loved. And I loved him back, not the name, but the man. Marissa took a step back, her eyes glossy, not from emotion, but from shame. Preston forced a laugh, awkward, sarcastic, like he needed it to believe his own doubt. How convenient. No one ever saw the 2 of you together. No proof, just a story. Clara turned her gaze to him. Her hazel eyes glinted with something no one had seen before, unwavering faith in what never needed to be proven. You really think Richard Davenport, the man who built an empire from nothing, would let anyone forge his signature? Preston froze. Words caught in his throat. Clara looked around, her face no longer simply calm. It now carried another layer, pain forged into quiet pride. "I'm not standing here to reclaim dignity. I'm here to return the truth, back to where it belongs." Across the room, Gerald turned away, unable to meet her eyes. Evans shut off her phone, hands trembling. Marissa gripped her handbag like someone might take from her something she never truly possessed, a power that was never hers to begin with. Clara bowed her head, gently, not out of submission, but as a farewell. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for letting Richard leave this world without seeing the true faces of those he called family one last time. But if he were here, I don't think he'd be surprised by what just unfolded." The room was wrapped in silence after Clara's quiet confirmation. No more laughter, no more venomous whispers, just stunned stares, part disbelief, part fear. Attorney Arthur Grayson cleared his throat gently and opened his worn leather case. His fingers, accustomed to guarding secrets as weighty as gold, carefully retrieved each document, neatly arranged inside a cream-colored folder. He laid them out on the table without drama, without haste. Only the truth. And truth, when made clear enough, needs no defense. "I understand that many in this room are skeptical," Grayson began, his voice even but heavy with finality. "Some believe this to be a mistake, or worse, a fabrication. Therefore, as instructed by Mr. Davenport, I will now present the supporting evidence." He held up a laminated document with a bright red seal. "Marriage certificate, signed July 17, 2016, at Boston City Hall. Witnesses: Michael Reed, public library clerk, and Sarah Ellis, nurse at Mount Hope Hospital." A soft gasp escaped from Eleanor. She stepped back slightly, as though the truth had just slapped the varnish off her pride. Grayson continued. "Letters, handwritten by Mr. Richard Davenport to Mrs. Clara Holden, one each year on their anniversary. All preserved, all verified by handwriting experts." He pulled out a bundle of aged pages, their edges yellowed with time. The writing was firm, distinct, like the man himself once was. In the letter dated July 17, 2021, he wrote, "My Clara, another year has passed. I don't know how to thank you enough for not leaving, even when the world never knew who we were to each other. I know I'm not a perfect husband, but if there's one thing I'm certain of, it's this: no one has ever stayed by my side without asking for anything, except you." Grayson's voice softened on the final line, not because it wavered, but because he could feel it, the weight of love when written in truth. Clara lowered her head. She didn't cry, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her cloth bag, as if to hold on to the man's memory one last time inside this cold, glittering room. Grayson opened another envelope. "Joint bank account, opened 5 years ago under the names of Richard and Clara Davenport, used for personal expenses and discreet charitable contributions to foundations they co-founded, anonymously." And finally, he pulled out a small silver USB stick, placing it gently on the table. A video file, extracted from a private security camera at the Vermont cabin where Mr. and Mrs. Davenport spent most of their time together, as well as a recorded message filmed this past March, per Mr. Davenport's instructions. Clara looked up. She hadn't known a video existed. For a moment, doubt flickered in her eyes, then quietly dissolved into gratitude. Grayson plugged the USB into a nearby projector. The lights dimmed. A pale blue glow from the screen washed over the room. Richard Davenport appeared, not in his usual commanding suit, but in a simple knit sweater, seated beside a fire. His graying hair, his lined face, all of it softened, aged, real. "If you're watching this, then I'm likely no longer in that room," his voice came through, deep, steady. "I know that one day the truth would be questioned. Clara warned me. Silence has a cost, but I have no regrets." He paused, then looked directly into the camera. "Clara is my wife. The only woman I've ever loved without doubt. Not because I had to, not because of contracts or convenience, but because I knew I could give her everything and lose nothing. If you came here for assets, remember this: wealth can be divided, but trust cannot. The screen went dark, and the entire room fell silent. No one had anything left to say. No one had any ground left to argue. Clara remained standing, her hand resting softly on the table, right beside the letter Richard had written her. She was no longer the woman who looked like a maid, no longer the faint figure in a painting of opulence and legacy. She was the only inheritance Richard Davenport had chosen, not because she demanded it, but because she deserved it. The room was still gripped by the silence left behind by Richard Davenport's video, a silence so thick it wasn't born of respect, but of being backed into a corner. No one had expected the man they thought long gone to leave behind such a clear, unshakable message, and for a woman they once considered unworthy of even a seat at the table. But just then, before the air had a chance to settle, before anyone could fully process what they had just witnessed, the sound of the main doors creaked open. Slow, heavy, and loud enough to toll like a warning bell. Every head turned, and every breath caught in the room. Richard Davenport, not on a screen, not in a letter, but in the flesh. His hair still silver, now neatly combed. A dark suit, modest, without a tie. He was thinner than before, but his eyes, deep blue and sharp as ever, swept across the hall with the weight of a man who had seen too much. No one moved. No one dared believe. Marissa was the first to react, but she didn't run toward him. She stepped back, mouth agape. "Oh, my God! No, this can't be—" Preston went pale. His hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. Clara Holden, the only one who didn't seem surprised. There was only the faint shimmer of a tear in her eyes. Then it was gone. She took a deep breath, not like someone demanding vindication, but as if she had only been waiting to see he was still alive. Richard stopped at the center of the room. His voice rang out, not loud, but firm enough to hammer against the stone walls. "I assume you've all heard the will by now." No one replied. "And I assume," he continued, his gaze passing over Evans, Gerald, then resting on Preston, "you've also revealed exactly who you are, thinking I wouldn't be around to witness it." Preston let out a dry, broken laugh. "You? You faked your death? This was your sick little test?" Richard narrowed his eyes. He didn't need to say much. Instead, he turned to Grayson. "Arthur, do you have the recording from that day?" Grayson nodded, pulled out his phone, and tapped play. A voice recording played through the speakers. Familiar voices filled the air, relatives huddled around Richard's hospital bed, believing he was unconscious. "If he really dies, I want the Manhattan properties." "We'll take the Aspen Villa." "Hope the old man croaks already." "Don't call the doctor yet. We need to sort out the inheritance first." Richard stopped the recording with a tap. The room snapped back to the present. I heard every word. Even in that fog of coma, I knew I was being buried alive by the eyes of my own blood. No one could raise their head. And so I chose to disappear, not out of despair, but to watch, to see who would mourn me, who would care for Clara, and who would only care about a piece of paper. He turned to Clara then. For the first time, his voice softened. "And you never once failed me." Clara gave a small nod. No tears, no smile, just enough. Richard turned back to the room. "I spent my life building an empire, and I survived my own death to tear down what I once thought was family. Clara isn't just the woman I loved. She's the only proof I have left that kindness doesn't need paperwork to be real, and she's the only one I trust with everything I've built." Eleanor's voice trembled as she clung to a final plea. "Richard, you can't do this. Blood is still blood." "Blood," Richard cut her off, eyes sharp as glass, "is not insurance for greed. I've made my choice, and for the first time in my life, I have nothing left to reconsider. He turned to Grayson, his tone calm, final. "Carry out what we agreed on. One by one, based on their behavior today, each person on that list will receive exactly what they deserve." The air inside the grand hall now felt thick, like someone had locked the doors, trapping everyone inside, not just with Richard's piercing gaze, but with the naked truth unraveling in front of them, one soul at a time. He stood at the center of the room, posture straight, no raised voice, no theatrics. Just Richard Davenport, his eyes cold and unwavering, and their pasts, once cloaked in family, now laid bare like deep cuts slashed across the open will. "Now then," Richard said, his voice low and deliberate, "tell me this. Did any one of you ever ask Clara, even once, 'Are you okay?' When I disappeared, when you thought I might be dead?" No one spoke. A few heads dropped. Eyes that once looked with pride now stared down at their expensive shoes in silence. He turned to Preston, the nephew he once carried in his arms when the boy was just 3. "You were the first to mock Clara, called my wife a maid. Tell me, Preston, if I had truly been in that coffin, what would your eulogy have been? Thank you for the stock shares?" Preston swallowed hard, his lips trembling. I didn't know. You were alive. Not knowing is one thing, but choosing to lay your greed bare in daylight, that's on you." Richard's voice held no hint of mercy. Then he turned to Marissa, the smiling niece who always sent him ornate birthday cards but never actually showed up. "And you, Marissa, you walked right up to my wife just to humiliate her in front of everyone. You tugged your dress, raised your chin, dismissed her, like you had the right to judge someone's worth by the fabric they wear." "I didn't think she was—" Marissa stammered, eyes glistening. "Exactly. You didn't think, and that is the problem." His gaze landed next on Evans, the youngest niece, whose social media fame had ballooned from turning Clara into a laughingstock. "Clara," he said, not with affection but formality. "You turned a woman who cared for me, who guarded my medical secrets for years, into a meme, a cheap trend for clicks and views." Evans began to cry, but Richard didn't waver. He said one thing only. "Fame built on the humiliation of others is not fame. It's a stain, and you'll learn to scrub it with your own hands." His eyes swept next to Gerald Hayes, the man who once shared business dinners, but was also the first to rise and call Clara a fraud. "Gerald, I once believed you were a true friend. But the moment I was unconscious, you plotted how to divide my estate. And today, you shouted for Clara to be thrown out." Gerald gripped the chair arm, his aged face burning with shame. "I thought you were gone," he muttered, "and that gave you the right to behave like a vulture?" The air turned leaden. Richard looked back at the room, each person who once called him uncle, brother, grandpa, now nothing more than cracked masks at his feet. He turned to Grayson and nodded. The attorney opened a dark red folder, each page marked. "As per the updated directive," Grayson announced, "any individual found to have insulted or defamed Mrs. Clara Holden Davenport through speech, conduct, or online activity shall be fully removed from all inheritance. This includes shares, property, and access to trust funds." Then he began to read. Preston Davenport, Marissa Lang, Evans, Gerald Hayes, Eleanor Thorne. Each name dropped like a verdict, the sound of judgment landing in a courtroom built of crystal and silence. A few sniffles broke the stillness. Some opened their mouths to object, only to close them again. Because how do you argue when the man you thought was dead is standing there watching everything? Richard ended it with a single line that needed no further explanation. Truth doesn't need agreement, only the courage to show itself. And today it chose to stand beside the only person who never turned away from me. The air in the grand hall felt like winter had descended without warning in the middle of April. Each name Grayson spoke, dry, clear, merciless, fell like a hammer against the marble floor, shattering whatever illusion of entitlement those in the room still clung to. Preston Davenport, Marissa Lang, May Evans, Gerald Hayes, Eleanor Thorne. With every name, another figure froze in place, lips tightening, eyes wide with disbelief, like they'd just been exiled from a kingdom they once believed they were born to rule. But that kingdom had shut its gates. And the keys no longer belonged to them. Preston was the first to break, his voice raw with desperation. "Uncle Richard, you can't do this. I'm your blood?" Richard looked him straight in the eye. Not a blink. "And what is blood worth, Preston, when you were the first to trample my wife just to sit in a more luxurious chair?" Marissa stepped backward, her gown clinging to her like regret. She searched the room for a friendly glance, an ally, but no one dared speak now. Not even Eleanor, once the loudest voice in the room, now gripped the arm of her chair like a frail woman bracing for a storm. Evans, heels perfectly polished, hair perfectly pinned, and the phone that once weaponized Clara's pain, now stared at its cracked screen, watching her follower count plummet after the internet turned on her. Grayson gave a discreet nod, and at that cue, two security officers, impeccably dressed but unmistakably firm, entered from the back of the room. They walked slowly, with calm precision, approaching each person. No handcuffs, no force, just a gentle tap on the elbow, a silent message. "You no longer belong here." Preston was escorted first. He resisted. "You'll regret this. She fooled you, Uncle. She—" "Enough, Preston." Richard cut him off. No anger, just detachment. "The way you treated others when you thought I was gone is all the proof I needed." Marissa began to cry as she was led away, her red gown trailing behind her like a smudged streak of lipstick. She didn't scream. She knew it was too late. Evans, stripped of bravado, turned to Clara, not with hatred now, but with a silent plea for forgiveness. Clara met her gaze. Calm. Not cold, but resolute. The look of someone who had already endured the wound, crossed through pain, and now stood on the other side of pride, needing no revenge because justice had spoken on her behalf. Gerald Hayes, though the eldest among them, left the quietest. No arguments, no defiance. Just a slow nod toward Richard before turning away. Perhaps he was the only one who truly understood. It wasn't the fortune he had lost that haunted him, but the character he had once so easily thrown away. Clara remained where she stood, beside Richard. No tears, no smiles, just a quiet dignity that radiated louder than any words. She didn't need to speak, she didn't need to act, because in her refusal to retaliate, she had already become the harshest reminder to those who once looked down on her from above. Richard tilted his head toward her, just slightly, but it said everything. "Thank you for your silence and for being right." A few people still in the room, very few, stood quietly to the side. They had never laughed, never mocked, never humiliated Clara. And now they were allowed to stay. Not because they were close to Richard, but because they had shown respect for another human being when they had no reason to. And that was enough. When the heavy doors finally closed behind those who had once mocked and schemed, the Davenport hall fell into a quiet so profound it was as if the chaos had never happened. Midday light slanted through stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns across the stone floor, no longer reflecting vanity, but something else entirely, the quiet integrity of those who remained. 3 people were still standing there, not because they shared blood with Richard, not because they once sat on a board, but simply because, among all the watching eyes, they were the few who had looked at Clara and seen a person. An older man with silver hair, Michael Reed, the librarian who had witnessed their marriage years ago, nodded gently toward her. "I knew who you were the moment you stepped in." Not by name, but by the way you still looked at him. A woman in a faded nurse's uniform, Sarah Ellis, stepped forward and took Clara's hand. "Thank you for not letting go of him, even when we thought no one had the patience left." Clara gave their hands a gentle squeeze. A smile crossed her lips, not radiant, not showy, just warm, quietly sincerely warm. In a room once thick with pretense, it felt like the first real thing. Richard stood beside her, no longer sharp-eyed and steel-spined, but softened, like a man finally setting down a weight he had carried for far too long. He glanced around the now silent hall, empty chairs, silent corners, the flowers still fragrant but untouched. I used to think the greatest thing I'd leave behind was an empire, numbers, assets, buildings. But now I know. The greatest thing I ever truly owned was the loyalty and kindness given to me by someone who never asked for anything. He turned to Clara. You never needed to prove anything. You never wanted the wealth. And because of that, you're the only one who deserves all of it. Clara shook her head softly, smiling. I don't need all of it, Richard. I just need to see you, alive, still you. They looked at each other. There was no movie kiss, no dramatic embrace, just two, hands reaching, quiet, steady, and true. Behind them, Michael, Sarah, and a young woman named Anna, the gardener who had offered Clara a glass of water earlier, stood quietly, as if unwilling to disturb the moment. Richard nodded at them. You three didn't have to do anything grand. You just looked at someone without looking down. And that's worth more to me than any share ever could be. Grayson closed the folder and placed it back into his briefcase. The legalities were over. But he knew this story would live far longer than any of the documents he just filed away. Clara walked toward the stained glass window, gazing out into the garden. The lavender was starting to bloom. Richard, shall we go home? He followed her gaze, then smiled. Yes, let's go home. We've got more important things to care for now, like flowers and peace. 3 months after the reading of the will, the name Clara Holden Davenport was no longer gossip, no longer a headline. She had become a quiet symbol of grace, of patience, of unwavering dignity. But there was one thing few knew. One person returned, not to reclaim wealth, not to make excuses, but to make amends. Evans, the niece who had once led the online mockery, shut down all her social media accounts that same night. Her followers asked where she'd gone. She didn't answer. Weeks later, she appeared at a community center in a poor neighborhood in the north end of the city, one quietly funded for years by Clara Holden, who had supported its library and children's classes without ever seeking credit. Evans sat with the kids, teaching them how to shoot simple videos, not to chase views, but to tell quiet stories no one ever bothered to hear. One day, she sent Clara a short letter, her handwriting shaky, like a heart learning how to stand still again. I'm sorry, not for losing the inheritance, but for almost losing myself. Thank you for not striking back because of that. I learned how to begin again. Clara read the letter, folded it, and tucked it into the same drawer where she kept Richard's old love letters. She didn't reply. But the next morning, on a table in the community center, there was a bouquet of purple lavender and a handwritten note. Kindness needs no voice. Let it bloom quietly. And what about you? Do you believe that those who once stumbled deserve a chance to stand again? Tell us in the comments. Share the moments when you've seen someone change in the most unexpected ways. If this story touched you, please like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel for more stories where even the smallest crack can let the light in.